Just want to take a minute to introduce myself to those of you who have not had the pleasure to meet. My name is Lynette Martins. I am one of two Jaharis Faculty Fellows. Our other one is here, Professor Knox. And I teach in the fall law and ethics of AI in healthcare. So that's what I'm teaching in the fall. And then the spring, I teach health equity and the law, or I will be teaching that in the spring. So I'm thrilled to be here to be in conversation with you about a topic that touches on kind of both of these areas. And specifically, I really want to talk about the medical translation services and threats to health equity. Before I begin, I just want to give a quick shout out, grateful to Julian and Brett and everyone else in the center for hosting this and for corralling everybody to be here today. Okay. So many of you have this on your phones. We see this pretty commonly and we can access it quite easily. So I'll share a quick anecdote to kind of set the stage for this conversation. And over the summer, my family and I were able to travel to a non-English speaking country. We were able to get by on the usual mundane things using our iPhone translator. The usual tourist things like directions, restaurants, and sites to see. But what happens when the stakes are a little bit higher? And this is what happened in the case for Willie Ramirez. This is a very important case, medical malpractice case, considering language barriers. And Willie Ramirez is arguably the most important medical malpractice case related to language and prejudice. As a result of an interpretation error, Willie's brain hemorrhage was misdiagnosed and he was left as a quadriplegic. If you want a deep dive into this particular case and some of the interesting facts, this is an excellent book to kind of take note of. So I'll share some of the facts that might be relevant to illustrating here what under this sort of umbrella of health equity. So on January 22nd, 1980, 18-year-old Willie Ramirez ate a nice, yummy fast food hamburger. That evening, he fell down unconscious and his Cuban family thought it was the hamburger that made him sick. They tried to explain to the emergency room doctor that he was, quote, intoxicado, which in Cuban Spanish means I'm ill due to something that maybe perhaps I ate, I'm allergic to, something vague. Willie's teenage girlfriend mentioned that they had been arguing, which actually caused the ER doctor to piece together a story that was completely wrong and inaccurate. He thought Willie was intoxicated. It sounds like intoxicado, right? That he had taken an intentional drug overdose because he was upset at his girlfriend and the fight that they had. No qualified interpreter was used or called in because the parties believed they were communicating adequately. Although not consciously prejudiced, the doctor there was influenced by an implicit association between drug abuse and the young Cuban male. But Willie was a health-conscious baseball player. He was an athlete who actually never used alcohol or drugs. Willie was mistakenly treated for a drug overdose while his brain continued to hemorrhage. The interpreting error perpetuated by a series of mishaps. Willie was admitted to the ICU by an upper-class Spanish-speaking Bolivian doctor who failed to confirm the medical history because of his disdain for the working-class Cuban family. The entire medical team who attended to Willie accepted the initial diagnosis of, quote, drug overdose, and did not question it until the patient nearly died. For 36 hours, anyone missed the signs of the brain hemorrhage. Everyone missed the signs of the brain hemorrhage. When it was finally diagnosed, surgery was performed to stop the bleed, but it was too late. When it was finally diagnosed, the surgery but it was too late. Now, I shared this story not to say that Willie's life is not worth living or there's any quality that has been diminished. He is alive and well and married and has a biological daughter here. This is really to illustrate some of the barriers and limitations to access to care due to language and some of the ensuing harm that would not have ordinarily occurred. Patients, as we know, come from a range of backgrounds. Their literacy and health literacy are varied. This happened in another case of the Tran family. It's critical to understand this particular case kind of solidifies what we've been talking about a little bit. And this case is about a Vietnamese family living in California in the 1990s. The family's 9-year-old daughter was hospitalized. The medical team depended on the patient and her sibling to communicate some of the medical problems that she was having to the parents. Ultimately, a misunderstanding about the prescription resulted in tragic death of this 9-year-old girl. Now, if you're working in healthcare, you understand the high stakes for translation, right? You need more than just the ability to translate word for word. You need to have fluency. And that requires you to have the fluency also in the medical literacy, in medical context, in both your language and perhaps the other person's as well. And so the words selected can definitely shape the way that you and the patient interact, but also some of the medical choices. And that's a responsibility that should be handled with care. It's really critical to the understanding of not only when diagnosing patients, but also when communicating treatments or results. If using a family member, like happened in this case, something to think about is what happens to that particular family member. Is it burdensome to them if using them to communicate results, potentially like of a terminal illness? Might they want to communicate that? Would they try to protect their family member by relaying incorrect information? And also there's a lack of agency for that particular patient, right? So these are things to kind of think about. This is another interesting case of a LEP is an acronym for Limited English Proficiency, where a restaurant worker came into the emergency room coughing up blood. And if you know anything about that, that is kind of a red flag for something like tuberculosis. However, he came in with his coworker and was not able to communicate. Both of them struggled to communicate some of the symptoms and how some of his medical history. Now, he did not want to disclose some of his medical history in front of his coworker for obvious reasons. He was embarrassed. He didn't feel like he could trust him, so on and so forth. So the workers there cultured his specimen. Turns out he was positive for tuberculosis, although he lied about it during medical history taking. And so what does this mean for medical translation? Is it something that we should use? So according to a study in 2012, this was a systematic review that surveyed a lot of studies that looked at the veracity or the kind of how robust our medical translation services are. And so while I pointed out a few sort of cases, specific cases, turns out that the Willie Ramirez or the previous one I spoke about with the TB patient is actually not uncommon. So in this particular study, in the Annals of Emergency Medicine, it found that using a professional medical interpreter was actually associated with a significantly more lower likelihood of consequential errors compared to using no interpreter or an ad hoc one, such as a family member, as we saw with the Tran family. Errors made by non-professional interpreters, especially when translating from their native language to an official language, is very prone to omissions, additions, and mistranslations, which could lead to serious clinical consequences. And in healthcare, this is something we need to think about. So just to kind of give you some idea of why this might be significant, we have an estimated number of, an estimated 25 million people in this country that have limited English proficiency. Current estimates, including the fact that we don't actually use medical interpreters in healthcare quite as much as we should. And the vast majority, the estimates right now are about 97% of patients utilize the family or ad hoc staff members to translate. So that brings about some interesting questions about what it means to have access to care, some of the barriers and help in accessing healthcare, and some of the preventable harms that happen to some of our patient populations in the medical context. I think these several scenarios kind of illustrate how essential also medical translation can be. But why is any of this important? Yes, we have a lot of people with limited English proficiency. Why am I talking about this now? Okay, so many of you might have seen this, but I'll jog your memory a little bit. So in March of this year, President Trump issued or signed Executive Order 1424, designating English as the official language of the United States. It was framed, right, towards this concept of national cohesion, unity. We're all kind of expressing ourselves in the same medium and language. But the order actually revoked a Clinton-era directive from the earlier part of 2000s and late part of 1990s, an executive order that had promoted access to government services for individuals with limited English proficiency. So first, the order designates, as it says, that English is the official language of the United States. However, no federal law exists that gives the president the authority to designate English as the official language, nor does the order actually claim to do so. But the order stops short of requiring agencies to abandon non-English services, and it makes a sharp turn in some of the policies that we have been thinking about in this space that already influence federal enforcement. English-only mandates are no longer merely symbolic. They are becoming enforcement priorities. This becomes important a little bit more in some other areas like employment law, but we've seen it and less so in this particular instance in health law. But unfortunately, the impact that this has had, this executive order has been to make things a little bit confusing and chaotic. And so you will see a lot of patients now confused about whether or not they do or do not have access to this type of service. And providers are also unclear to this point. And so maybe that was the purpose to begin with, to scare people from accessing healthcare or asking for the simple assistance of being able to communicate with their healthcare providers. So a little bit of background. I told you about the most recent executive order from President Trump. Kind of speaks to this Clinton-era executive order entitled Improving Access to Services for Persons with Limited English Proficiency. This really was significant because at the time it drew national attention to the issue of limited English proficiency when he issued it, right? It really just kind of reiterates some of our federal protections anyways, like Title VI requirements for federal fund recipients, and directs all federal agencies to ensure that their own programs provide equal access to persons with limited English proficiency. In response to this, OCR issued an extensive policy guidance that was upheld, which really assisted healthcare providers and other federal recipients in meeting their obligations to those with limited English proficiency. This largely continued during the Bush administration with some minor adjustments, just to clarify for small businesses or nonprofits that may not have had the resources to provide this kind of service. Several factors were considered in that guidance, but now let's come back to a couple of months ago where Attorney General Bondi had advanced this memo from the DOJ providing some guidance. So in March 22nd, the DOJ issued a notice that it was repealing its prior guidance from 2002 on the provision of language access as required by the order. This notice recognizes, however, that recipients of federal funding have a quote, continuing obligation to comply with Title VI, all applicable Title VI implementing regulations, all applicable federal civil rights laws and non-discrimination provisions. Okay, that sounds reasonable. As acknowledged by DOJ, the mandate to provide language access under Title VI and other statutes such as the Stafford Act and the ACA remain unchanged for entities operating with federal funds such as courts, schools, healthcare providers, and so on. These entities must continue to provide individuals with limited English proficiency with translated documents, interpretation services, and language access at no charge by qualified interpreters. And so a couple of things I just want to do here. First is to shamelessly promote my own paper that I co-wrote with some authors. This really kind of talks about a little bit of like the ethics of why this might be important, right? So really here what we did was think about some of the more normative discussions about why healthcare providers really should lean in to affirming this access to language, especially for their patients with limited English proficiency, and also some discussion on some of the actionable steps, both for organizations and healthcare providers. So I just want to underscore something from this paper. Safety net hospitals and federally qualified health centers, which serve most patients with limited English proficiency, are facing unprecedented financial pressures that may force them to consider reducing language services or turning to less expensive technology-based services such as AI-assisted interpretation. Currently, this type of tool has a weak evidence base to support their utility. Additionally, some clinicians may find the suggestion to rely on technology rather than professional interpreters is an affront to the patient-clinician relationship. Given that high-quality communication with patients requires attention to context and cultural norms, nuanced verbal and nonverbal communication, and careful choice of language. And I don't know if I really emphasize this, but if you can see this last part here, it says use technology in the DOJ guidance, use technology to save costs, and it really advances the idea of removing in-person translation and instead shifting to AI-based software. Okay. So there are standards for translations. So importantly, national standards for culturally and linguistically appropriate services have been developed, CLAS class, to reduce health disparities and patient harm from language barriers. They also offer best practices for use of interpreters and translated materials in healthcare settings. By contrast, the use of AI and other tech tools for translation and interpretation has not been adequately studied and may cause unintended adverse consequences. Healthcare organizations' duty to care can also be understood as an ethical obligation to non-abandonment. Healthcare organizations and clinicians must not abandon patients who have difficulty speaking or reading English. So, I want to talk a little bit about some of the obvious things here, right? We know that there are federal legal protections here for language. So in the federal arena, we have three major areas that we think about and protections for language access. And one of the main ones is the Civil Rights Act from 1964. Over the past 40 plus years since, the linguistic diversity of our country really has burgeoned. Now we have almost 300 different languages spoken across the country. In interpreting Title VI, the Supreme Court has treated discrimination based on language as equivalent to national origin discrimination. Let's put a pin on that for a little bit. Similarly, the federal government in its regulations and policies has treated language as a proxy, for national origin. Therefore, in federally funded programs and activities, people who speak a language other than English are entitled to treatment equal to that of English speakers. Of course, Title VI applies across all agencies, from the DOJ to Department of Health and Human Services, and HHS has actually expounded on this. So just to underscore this, this is the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which clarifies exactly what we are talking about right now. And each federal department has a civil rights office that is charged with ensuring that its department's programs are free of discrimination. HHS's Office for Civil Rights is no exception. Its responsibilities are vast, but generally include enforcing the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination Act, and HIPAA, in addition to others as well. So any organization or individual who receives monies through HHS, health departments, health plans, social services, agencies, nonprofits, hospitals, so on, physicians, they are subject to OCR oversight. OCR has the authority to investigate complaints related to linguistic barriers. So this has been an approach that people have found successful, and some cases have arisen in like Boston City Hospital, now Boston Medical Center in Massachusetts, Harbor Medical Center in Washington State, and San Francisco General Hospital in California were all targets of OCR complaints filed on behalf of LEP patients and developed or enhanced their language assistance programs in response to these complaints. Okay, so now I think that kind of largely leads into this legal responsibility for healthcare providers and institutions. The legal responsibility to provide language access applies across all federal programs and activities, including healthcare. We are not exempt. So despite the federal right to language access for LEP patients in healthcare settings, the reality is that many healthcare organizations and providers are actually not aware of this responsibility. And they have not prioritized this issue or have not been held accountable through consistent enforcement of these laws. So most of health policy, as you might recall, or you might start to think about, happens either incrementally and also sort of in a patchwork from states. So in my state of New Jersey, they require their Department of Health to disseminate informational brochures on something like breast cancer, but they don't actually, they do this for English and Spanish, but not for other medical conditions such as lung cancer or other languages as well. The 3 states, New Jersey, California, Washington, have enacted requirements that physicians or other healthcare professionals receive training. So they actually receive training in some kind of cultural competency or cultural humility. I'm not quite sure if these are solutions, but they are filling some kind of void and gap in this whole landscape. So the political agenda driving states on language access is particularly notable. And some of you may have noticed this in sort of this reproductive rights space. Besides Michigan, several other states, including Arkansas, Kansas, and others, have passed these Women's Right to Know Acts. And these typically require information about things like adoption or fetal pain associated with abortion and some possible, maybe perhaps side effects or detrimental effects of abortion to be translated into non-English language. They're often at a much lower threshold than required for other interpretation or translation services. So, technology and translation services. What do we think about this, right? Are we happy, excited, or do we think this is dystopian, or a little bit of all of the above? And I think I'll share some of where I think this is going. I think as a medical professional, of course, you understand there's some need for clarity, which is very crucial in your examination room. Every word counts, whether you're explaining a diagnosis in writing, scheduling a procedure, or writing a prescription for some kind of treatment. Everything is critical. When a language barrier occurs, there is a sudden dependence on translations that must be precise, not only grammatically, but also medically and contextually. Even a mistranslated word can alter a diagnosis, delay a treatment, potentially prevent someone from accessing care, or cause, in many instances, unnecessary panic or anxiety. Sadly, as we talked about earlier, history has demonstrated that poor medical translation can be a matter of life and death. For those reasons and more, it would be good to know what the language, what AI and AI translation applications and languages looked like. Recently, a law professor friend shared a funny story about how she was alerted to being cited in a paper. And when she looked at it, it turned out that the citation was completely wrong. It was entirely made up, and it generated even a pin site. She was really concerned about this. And I think this, and among other things, illustrate how AI can hallucinate and create something where it does not exist. And as we've talked about, this adds on to the complexity of talking about some very personal and vulnerable issues in the examination room. So what does the current AI translation tech look like? I don't want to be the person who says, I'm anti-tech. Ms. Martins, why are you so anti-tech all the time? No, that's not my point. My point is, some of the times I'm anti-tech. And so I think that comes about when there's decreased patient safeguards, and that's where my priorities lie. Does the technology help those in need of technology? Is it actually protecting or helping the people it is trying to help? Some lessons can be learned here in the disability space. And if any of your students in Professor Epstein's colloquium class, there was a really interesting paper that Professor Roberts wrote on disability and telemedicine that I think speaks to this a little bit as well. In the paper, we learned that this happens in the disability space, particularly in telemedicine, in which there was supposed to be an increase in access to care, but there are multiple problems now that it has actually created. We do know that some types of AI, like LLMs, perform statistical pattern matching rather than actually understanding context. They're not quite there yet in understanding nuance. And they cannot really flag ambiguity, which medical translators would. So what does this look like? Here's another systematic review of the role of language in medical translation and AI. Sorry, a review of the software's AI's translation software and how it's used in interpretation. And some of the accuracy scores ranged pretty high, 83 to 97%, but this is when translating from English. It was 36 to 76% when translating to English. Any idea why this might be the case? Yeah, Simon. Sorry, Ash, yeah.
The software is probably developed in English, right?
Yeah, the training data. We know that some of the tools that we use are trained on a particular data set. And what's probably likely happening here is that the data set that they're being trained on is dominated by English, which poses a whole lot of issues.
I can ask a question on that. Were there any languages that kind of brought down the percentage?
Yeah, in translating from English
To
English. Yeah, I don't there wasn't a wide range of errors in that on that side of the translation. So it's pretty consistently accurate.
No, when you're translating from one language to English, that was where
Oh, sorry, you were asking the accuracy from when translating from English
when translating to English.
English. Yeah, so obviously the ones that were on the lower scale were the Asian languages that had a different script, and those that were higher, had a higher accuracy were Spanish and other more common language. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So before we become like a negative Nancy, I don't want to do that, because we know that there are clear benefits of AI in medical translation. So the obvious ones I'm going to list here because they really are benefits, right? Increased speed and productivity. We know that we have at our fingertips, we can translate something very quickly. This can help facilitate something and maybe perhaps like an urgent care situation or an emergency where time is critical. And of course, productivity, something that might have taken us 4 days is now taking us 10 seconds. The second one here is standardization and consistency. This just speaks to some of the ways that we might frame or phrase different diseases. So if you remember in the early days of COVID, it was SARS, we didn't really know what it was called, and then it was SARS-CoV-2. But then we all sort of transitioned to COVID, and I think having that level of standardization sometimes can be helpful. But also, the big one here is multilingual support. So you can click into your phone and decide from any number of languages what you would like to translate to or from. And it's not relying on just one person being proficient and fluent in one particular language. Did you get a good one? So this is something I talk about a lot in class, which is kind of the paradox of using AI in health, because we want to increase access. We want to have more, right? Like having an app on your phone at your fingertips within seconds, having an answer to a question, a translation question, arguably increases our access. Whether or not the accuracy is there yet in the medical context, I think is a question we need to really answer. But other things are just this sort of overconfidence in relying on, oh, I just put something into a machine and it gave me an output, and now I'm going to take that as accuracy. we talked a little bit about the concept of lack of context, right? Understanding that words aren't just words. Give you an example. If I say in just a sort of conversation that I think I might have had a stroke, would the medical AI translator pick that up to mean either a CVA or a TIA, or would it just think I had a gentle touch, right? So I think this type of nuance is kind of lacking or still in sort of these entry-level type of phases. Of course, there's confidentiality concerns. With this increase in access comes collection of data. Where is this data stored? How is it being collected? Who's accessing it? Do we even know? I think for certain populations, especially people who are concerned about things that might be outside of the scope of healthcare, for instance, their immigration status, this becomes something of a concern. And of course, I don't know if you've heard about, you might have heard about this, but ambient listening, which is basically recording in, say you're in your examination room with your primary care doctor, rather than having someone actually physically typing or writing. This is something that is listening and recording to be able to translate or transcribe what's happening in the examination room, really to make sure that you're spending time with your clinician talking about the things that are most important, rather than he or she having their backs turned towards you, kind of typing on the computer about some of the symptoms that you're describing. So can you turn this off? Is someone who has an undocumented immigration status likely to come to see you if you have something like this? So I think this brings into question other things that fall out of the scope of healthcare, but are also considerations for patients. The other thing is, even though we have increased access to this tool, will it further entrench some of the already existing health disparities? We know that patients who are patients of color are often treated differently from those who are not. And so if the training data that your LLM or your AI tool has a more homogeneous training data set, will that then further entrench some of these existing health disparities? And what happens, we always think about this, what happens when something goes wrong? Who's to blame? And you can go down the list thinking about where liability may or may not attach. Is it the manufacturer of the AI tool for the medical translation service? Is it the hospital that used it? Is it the provider? Where does it fall in this line? Okay, so as we kind of talked about, meaning really is determined by not only just the words, but the context in which things are being spoken. This is really important for a variety of reasons. One is trust, right? Patient-clinician, sometimes building that rapport. It's not just a one visit type of situation. Over the course of time, you're building your rapport with some of your clinicians and building that trust, which is necessary. What are the larger implications of this for access to healthcare for all Americans, right? We talked a little bit about some of these built-in algorithmic designs that might further some of the health disparities that we see right now. And so, of course, the English dominance means that AI really performs better in English than in any other underrepresented languages. This further kind of speaks to some of the stereotypes and encoding, diluting some of the cultural context, and some of the actual unintentional consequences of algorithms might be discrimination rather than conscious intent. Okay. So what does this mean for the prospects of medical AI? Can this happen, medical translation services in using AI. So 3 areas that I feel need to have a little bit more clarification and where I kind of think about and where I'm concerned. One is obviously liability. We talked about where is liability attached. There's some discrimination concerns there. We don't know if the AI, this is an unintended consequence, but is there some kind of intent? And then this is a tech conference, so I want to talk a little bit about copyright issues that have been kind of moving through our imagination, and both in reality and elsewhere. So state courts addressing medical malpractice claims involving inadequate translation or interpretation services tend to apply traditional negligence standards requiring proof of duty, breach, causation, and damages. However, these cases face particular challenges in establishing the applicable standard of care and causation between interpretation failures and the actual ensuing medical injuries. Does this change now with the involvement of an AI-assisted tool? There is some clarity from case law that ultimately affirms the exclusion of expert testimony regarding the standard of care for using qualified interpreters because the plaintiff could not establish causation, holding that, quote, even if the court had admitted this doctor's standard of care opinions, the absence of causation evidence would have precluded an ultimate finding of liability. So on to copyright. This is an area that I think is evolving. You've probably seen it, you've heard it, you've read about it, seen it in the news quite a bit. The general concepts here are just here for regarding human authorship. Is this particular tool solely, is the output solely AI generated, or is it AI assisted? Is it an AI assisted work? This becomes less of a concern because a lot of the outputs in healthcare tend to just be something that is not copyrightable. So I'll give you an example. You go to get an X-ray of a broken bone, that an AI tool generates not only just the reading, but it gives you a report on it. That report is not going to be copyrightable. But what about the AI training data? What do we think about that? We want to say on the one hand, you need to have a robust system that's AI tool, and the way to get it, a robust tool, is to have great training data. But what happens when we encounter copywritten works that might be included in the training data? Could you have a fair use defense? Maybe. There's some data privacy concerns there to kind of contemplate. And then also, of course, you need to think about copyright infringement. All right, so continuing on in sort of this space where we don't really know what to expect because there's so much that hasn't actually gone through the courts yet, it would be really, really good, I think, to have some clarification. Now, I understand some of these will not be as feasible as others. I don't think HHS is going to clarify anything related to Title VI anytime soon, nor Section 1557. So another one that could potentially be explored is, could the FDA be involved in this in any way? Could there be some way of including this into their assessment of software as a medical device? Let's hold that thought for a minute. The third one is, we need to have liability standards established for healthcare institutions and vendors, and how are we going to establish accountability when inaccurate translations cause harm, with specific attention to causation challenges to medical AI liability. So sidebar on this, but also kind of a very important part of this conversation are the policy considerations. How do we even access medical translators in healthcare? So part of this is the financing for medical translators could be revised. Right now, we access medical translators through a mechanism through Medicaid reimbursement, but we need a financing mechanism for language assistance services across payers, which would lessen the extreme institutional variability in services that actually currently exists. Ideally, insurers would contract with and pay medical interpreters or language agencies directly to serve their patients, rather than leaving the providers, putting this in the provider's hands to be able to screen and choose and pay the interpreter. The second one is we need healthcare providers in on this. They need to be the medical champions here. And there needs to be significant investment in developing our medical interpreter workforce. The second one is we need healthcare providers to understand some of the bad effects of language barriers and the benefits of working with trained medical professionals. I told you earlier, in some states, they have passed laws that require this certain amount of cultural competency. And of course, we need LEP patients to be aware of their legal rights. So regarding healthcare providers, understanding their part of this, being a medical champion, they would also do well to advocate for language assistance services for their LEP patients, much in the same way they would advocate for any other diagnostic test or therapeutic agent. And since I can talk all day, I will conclude with these thoughts. First is language. I hope you understand that language is essential for effective communication in the medical context. Language barriers exist in accessing, oftentimes prevent someone from accessing care. The current administration is not supportive of non-English mediums and encouraging the use of AI instead of actual in-person medical translators in the medical context. And AI is not currently well suited for translation, as we talked about, hallucinations. So I end with that positive thought and welcome any and all of your questions. Thank you.
Are there any translation services being worked on or currently available that are specific to medical translation?
Yes, there are. They work in conjunction with certified translators. So I guess they have that human in the loop part. They do have to avoid copyright infringement. They do have licenses. And so they are geared more towards that nuance. They're still in their infant stages and they still require the oversight, but yeah, they do exist.
Would those be HIPAA compliant? Because I assume
Yes.
just using Google Translate would not be.
No, correct. They are HIPAA compliant. Yes, good question. And another kind of interesting thing to think about is medical translators are required to understand the kind of the boundaries of HIPAA and data privacy. And a lot of times when some of the new tools came on board, a lot of them would be putting in Google Translate or ChatGPT, can you translate this particular thing? And they were cautioned that that is actually not permitted. Any other questions? Yeah.
With the use of human translators and how that liability normally works, how would that differ between an AI tool?
Yeah, so right now we have the standard of care includes a medical translator. And if that medical translator is incorrect, it operates in much the same way as traditional negligence operates, right? I think what I was trying to communicate there is, does AI add a layer of complexity? Because there's that explainability part that we are trying to get around. So does it add anything to how we think about liability, or will it continue to be that way that we traditionally follow, right? So as I think that kind of the general thought here is we don't know, and we don't have a test case right now. We have some idea of how things might go, but it's kind of speculation at this point. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on the use of AirPod technology by doctors? Because AirPods supposedly are offering translation services now. And I'm wondering if in an emergency situation, a doctor wouldn't be tempted to rely on that, and whether they'd have any negligence liability.
Right, so these are all really interesting, relevant questions that I think are going to change how we think about liability. Will it be the standard of care now to be able to rely on these very easy to access digital devices, right? That can give us something within seconds.
Where time is of the essence.
When time, and essentially in an emergency situation. Yeah, I think right now it's probably unlikely. I think if you look at traditional, or not traditional, but if you just kind of look at how AI is being incorporated into medical care and healthcare in general, I think the uptake hasn't been quite as high as we would like. And so I think for it to become, although in some areas, I should say, it has been quicker than others. So as an example, accessing a database like Open Evidence, right? This is just kind of having an encyclopedia at your fingertips. It's free. So a lot of medical professionals access it instead of accessing something like kind of its predecessor from a different brand, which was Up to Date. And essentially this app would just, or software would just collate all of the clinical research studies out there. If you have a diagnosis or you have some kind of symptoms in this particular category and
do your differential diagnosis for you.
Correct. And so it's much more trusted in the diagnostic sense, but not trusted as much for the treatment. So there is some uptake in those types of things. Right now, you'll see a lot of physicians probably leaning into that type of technology because they just don't have the resources, or they don't know that they have the resources. There's so much of, there's a lack of knowledge, and then is there access? If there is access, how might we go about accessing it? Is it onerous? And you're right, like in the emergency context, I could see that happening. Yeah.
Are there precedents from other industries that provide insights into handling legal disputes stemming from AI translation errors or failures in healthcare?
Yeah, so I think we can look to the disability space a lot of times for this. And you get some sense from, for instance, if someone who is hearing impaired and they weren't able to access something, or they were discriminated against or something like that, there are cases that we can learn from in the lack of access, but also what standards might we derive from those types of cases. So yeah, in the disability space, particularly with the hearing impaired and deaf population. These are great questions. Yeah, Kendall.
In class, we sort of talked about like the paradox of bad data or like biased data, and whose responsibility is to like fix that problem. Is it on the developers, or is it on like the healthcare institutions to like generate unbiased data? I just don't know if you had any insights for
Yeah, so what Kendall is kind of sort of emphasizing or kind of questioning here is that it's this double-edged sword of, you want these apps to be robust and help and do what they say that they do, but then the way to do that is to get really robust data, which might also there's perverse incentives and so on and so forth to get that robust data. And so your question is, whose responsibility is that? And I think one way to think about that is, if the manufacturers, if you think about like a marketplace, the manufacturers want to have, like, let's say a dermatology tool that screens skin cancer. If you want to have a tool that is credible and accurate, you're going to want to, as a developer, ensure that your training data obviously is more diverse, right? So I think it really largely depends on some of what the tool is, and then what its designed or what's intended use would be.
It would be interesting to see how an informed consent claim would evolve with AI translation. What if the translation was incorrect and the patient claimed they were not adequately informed? What do you think of claims like this?
Yeah, this is something we talked about in class a little bit, because informed consent touches on everything. It touches on law, ethics, agency, self-determination, those types of things. And one of the things we kind of actually did talk about is if you are trying to develop, say, an informed consent form, and you go into your LLM and say, please develop an informed consent tool for me. What are some of the questions that might arise from that? Is this potentially a copyright violation? And we discussed how this may or may not qualify in those regards. But your question is specifically if the informed consent form that they developed from the AI tool was inaccurate.
It's what if the translation of the medical advice or the patient was incorrect because they were using AI?
And the question is yeah.
If the patient claimed they were not adequately informed that they were using
Yeah.
AI medical translation services and the AI gave a misdiagnosis or hallucination,
Yeah.
what about claims like that?
Yeah, so that's great. So informed consent is a big one. I didn't cover it in this, but it is something to kind of think about. And if I'm assuming the hospital is providing this informed consent, but is it truly informed? If it's wrong, I think the claim would obviously be right, like if the hospital, I'm assuming, is providing this, or if are you saying they're accessing it on their phone as like a Google Translate or something like that?
I don't know.
So it could be that it depends on who or what they're accessing the translation services from. If they are inputting it to their own device, then obviously that's on them. But I think it's likely to be in the hospital to put advance information that is accurate, correct in all languages. So.
Should our insurance policies adapting to cover liabilities arising from AI translation failure?
Oh, wow, this is
Health insurance?
Insurance or health insurance?
It just says insurance.
So I have thoughts on that, relying on.
I assume it's like the hospital's insurance policy.
Yeah, so medical translators
insurance.
buy their own insurance and it
Health
covers.
insurance, for clarification.
Health insurance for the patient?
Yes.
So if it's health insurance for the patient, does it cover their medical translation services?
So our insurance policies incorporating AI and AI failures, health insurance, hospital insurance, are they incorporating the potential for AI failures or the use of AI into their
I
policies?
don't think so, but that's definitely a question I will look into right now. I don't think so. Any other questions?
How are other countries dealing with this? I understand that America is a unique situation, especially with what's been going on, but are other countries adopting AI? Are they doing it in a better way, a more significant way, or are they kind of running into the same issues that we are?
I think some of the countries that follow the GDPR are probably running into some issues similar to what we are. And they may not necessarily, may have worked them out, because if you're neighboring a country that's you're in Switzerland and you're neighboring on different other countries that speak different languages, or you're in a country that speaks 4 different languages, I would assume that this would have a higher uptake just because the utility kind of outweighs some of the risks. So I think that probably is a nice stop for us to, to end on, and I hope you guys enjoyed it and have a wonderful rest of your day.